The Presidential Medal of Freedom, established in 1963 by President John F. Kennedy, is the highest civilian award offered by the United States government, or as Donald Trump so memorably describes it,
it's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, but civilian version. It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor, that's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets, or they're dead.
Over the years, many well-deserving figures have received this highest honor. Astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, and artists like Aretha Franklin and Bob Dylan. But some recipients of the medal have been questionable, like Michael Stop and Frisk Bloomberg, who was given his award by Joe Biden. Some have not aged well at all, like the sexual predator Bill Cosby, honored by George W. Bush. And others are downright baffling, like the billionaire casino tycoon Miriam Adelson, a recipient from Donald Trump's first term. Every US president since the award was established by JFK has given medals to figures who are clearly undeserving of the recognition. So here in this video are the 12 worst Presidential Medal of Freedom recipients, one for each president given from Kennedy to Biden. This is a completely subjective list, as what can be considered quote-unquote the worst just means what I find to be most unworthy of the highest honor in the land, either because they committed heinous crimes against humanity or had an overall negative impact on society. And the only rule I have is that I don't include presidents who received the medal from other succeeding presidents. So here we go through our list. The worst people to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. JFK selected 31 individuals for the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1963, but due to his untimely death that same year, the medals were officially presented later by his successor Lyndon B. Johnson. Unlike recent presidents who have been more inclined to give these awards to popular celebrities, Kennedy's selections mostly included run-of-the-mill statesmen and political figures. But the one who stands out, and the one who is definitely the most controversial as an honoree, is John J. McCloy, the Assistant Secretary of War during the Second World War and later the American High Commissioner of occupied Germany during the post-war recovery. In Roosevelt and Truman's administration, McCloy was the mastermind in carrying out the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. According to his biographer Kai Bird, McCloy was responsible for the decision more than any other official. Bird also writes that McCloy believed he had found a way around the Constitution and that he was willing to take the kind of harsh steps from which other civilians shrank. As late as 1981, when the US government started to debate whether or not to grant reparations to those who were interned, McCloy called the conditions of the camps very pleasant. But that was not McCloy's only dark legacy from the war. In 1944, when Jewish groups petitioned him to stop the genocide of Jews by bombing rail lines leading to the Auschwitz extermination camp, McCloy was dismissive, writing that such an operation would be a diversion of considerable air support and would not warrant the use of our resources. During the post-war years, when he served as the American High Commissioner of occupied Germany, McCloy also released various German war criminals, including Alfred Crump, an industrialist who profited from Jewish slave labor. So what was John F. Kennedy thinking when giving such a monster the highest distinction of the land? LBJ made so many terrible selections that he was actually one of the most difficult presidents for whom to choose just one honoree to be considered the worst. There was, for instance, Carl Vinson, a Georgia congressman and staunch segregationist who signed the Southern Manifesto against integration. This was certainly a somewhat baffling choice for Johnson, given that Vinson had voted against LBJ's Civil Rights Act in 1964. What makes this award even more puzzling is it came from the president who also honored civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph, who was instrumental for organizing the historic March on Washington. In the same year Carl Vinson was awarded. Away from politics, Johnson also gave the medal to T.S. Eliot. While Eliot was certainly one of the most acclaimed poets of the 20th century, he was also a raving racist, sexist, and anti-Semite, who wrote in one of his poems, "The Jew is underneath the lot," One might also question LBJ's recognition of Walt Disney for the award, although there is no doubt that Disney had an enormous cultural impact. His willingness to name names of alleged communists in Hollywood before the House Un-American Activities Committee helped the way for the McCarthyite witch hunt that soon followed. But if we want to narrow things down to the single worst Medal of Freedom recipient from the LBJ era, we would have to go with the man with the most blood on his hands. And that would probably be Robert McNamara, Johnson's Secretary of Defense and the man responsible for escalating the Vietnam War. As a result of McNamara's efforts, Indochina became the most bombed region in history, with 7.5 million tons of bombs dropped from 1965 to 1975, more than double the amount of all bombs used during World War II. Robert McNamara tried to rehabilitate his image decades later with his autobiography and Oscar-winning documentary Fog of War, in which he admits that Vietnam was a tragic mistake. It is, however, a whitewash to describe an atrocity, a war crime, and a genocide as a mere quote-unquote mistake. And it is because of his galling efforts to restore his image, I feel the need to correct the record myself by citing McNamara as one of the worst recipients of the Medal of Freedom. Given that he was president towards the end of the space race, Nixon gave some well-deserving awards to astronauts of the Apollo space program. But if we want to single out Robert McNamara for Johnson, it stands to reason that we choose Nixon's defense secretary, Melvin Laird. Laird, like McNamara, was similarly responsible for the brutal war in Indochina. Laird's most egregious act was covering up Operation Menu, the carpet bombing of Cambodia, which was carried out without congressional approval and illegal under the Constitution. Laird specifically authorized falsified reports to keep the bombing of Cambodia a secret from the public and the media. In a 1969 memorandum, he ordered the attacks on Cambodia to be in conjunction with the raids against Vietnam, writing, "Strikes on these latter targets will provide a resemblance to normal operations, thereby providing a credible story for replies to press inquiries." The bombing of Cambodia was not only against the law, but a genocidal war crime, with most estimates putting the death toll in the hundreds of thousands. Operation Menu also gave rise to the brutal totalitarian regime of the Khmer Rouge. Before the US started bombing Cambodia, there was very little prospect that the Khmer Rouge would eventually take over Cambodia. Pol Pot himself acknowledged that, during this period, his army consisted of fewer than 5,000 poorly armed guerrillas, scattered across the Cambodian landscape, uncertain about their strategy, tactics, loyalty, and leaders. But thanks to US bombing missions, anti-American sentiment soared, and the craters that the American B-52s left became the perfect recruitment tool for the Khmer Rouge. According to one former official of the guerrilla army, Chahit Do, America's bombing increased support for the Khmer Rouge from ordinary Cambodian citizens, and that sometimes the bombs fell and hit little children, and their fathers would be all for the Khmer Rouge. But Laird was not the only one guilty of bombing Cambodia. For that, we move on to our next subject, an even more repulsive creature. Gerald Ford in his short time in office gave a few medals to some pretty egregious figures. One of them was Donald Rumsfeld, who of course would go on to orchestrate the disastrous Iraq War under Bush decades later. Ford also awarded New York Governor and then later Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, a few years after he massacred prisoners and officers alike during the Attica prison uprising. When Rockefeller heard that some of the hostages in Attica were shot by troopers he sent in a failed rescue operation, Rockefeller merely responded, "That's life." But there's no question that the very worst person Ford gave the Medal of Freedom to was none other than his own Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Where do we even begin with Kissinger? He committed so many crimes against humanity that I'm not sure which was his worst. Was it the carpet bombing of Cambodia? We've already noted Melvin Laird's responsibility in covering up the atrocity. But as Nixon's right-hand man, Kissinger was really the main architect of the monstrosity. When he personally approved 3,875 bombing raids in Cambodia, Kissinger ordered General Alexander Haig to Kill anything that moves. Maybe Kissinger's worst act was ordering the CIA to overthrow Chile's democratically elected leftist government in 1973. Kissinger bluntly stated before the coup, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." Or perhaps his worst crime came in 1975, when Kissinger met with Indonesian dictator Suharto and gave him permission to invade East Timor. A day after their meeting, Suharto attacked East Timor, resulting in a genocide with at least 200,000 killed. This would leave out the time Kissinger backed Pakistan's brutal war against Bangladesh in 1971. Voicing his displeasure with India's support for Bangladesh, Kissinger was recorded saying to Nixon that Indians were just bastards, to which the president replied, "What they really need is a mass famine." Not only Ford's worst choice, Kissinger is perhaps the most evil person to win the Medal of Freedom. Carter gave a number of well-deserved medals, starting with his first honoree, Martin Luther King Jr., whose award was presented posthumously. Carter also gave the award to Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, a man who saved countless lives. Rachel Carson, the woman credited with kickstarting the modern environmental movement, was also a recipient of the award under Carter. Among the few questionable choices that Carter made for the medal, I'm going to say that his worst pick was the actor John Wayne, also honored posthumously. Wayne presents a complicated case. While it is true that the actor had been an iconic figure in Hollywood, playing the lead in classic films like The Searchers and True Grit, Wayne's politics were repulsive. Not only was he a supporter of Joseph McCarthy's witch hunt against alleged communists, he was also one of the founders of the right-wing Motion Pictures Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, which blacklisted left-wing actors and writers from employment in Hollywood. In 1968, he directed and starred in a pro-Vietnam War movie called The Green Berets, just as the American public was starting to turn against the war effort. At a time when Americans and Vietnamese were still being slaughtered, Wayne whitewashed the disastrous and barbaric war, giving it the simplified heroics of one of his cowboy westerns. Wayne was also a racist, stating, "I believe in white supremacy." During an infamous interview in 1971, he went on to add, "I don't feel guilty about the fact that 5 or 10 generations ago these people were slaves." Not surprisingly, Wayne's bigotry extended to other groups. In addition to making disparaging remarks about Native Americans, in his critique of Midnight Cowboy, he dismissed the film as a story about two. It is no wonder then that the segregationist George Wallace originally wanted John Wayne to be his running mate in his 1968 bid for the presidency. I generally believe that, in most cases, one needs to separate the art from the artist, so we shouldn't disparage anyone who still enjoys John Wayne's movies. But with Jimmy Carter, the president gave an award to the artist who should have been disregarded. Not surprisingly, it was also difficult to choose the worst honoree chosen by Ronald Reagan. He gave the medal to Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee for president in the 1964 election, who explicitly ran against civil rights. Reagan also gave one to the economist Milton Friedman, who's not only the father of neoliberalism, but also cheered and defended the brutal Chilean dictatorship of Pinochet. And Reagan also awarded his UN ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, who supported the Contras in Nicaragua. Also known as the Death Squads, they were responsible for numerous atrocities and massacres. So with already such a list of despicable people, you, the viewer, might be wondering why I decided to go with a saint like Mother Teresa. Well, a lot has to do with the fact that she, too, like Friedman and Kirkpatrick, was guilty of supporting mass murderers, and she was a complete fraud when it came to her so-called humanitarian work. For one, she maintained a very close friendly relationship with Haiti's brutal dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier, also known as Baby Doc, who awarded her with the Legion of Honor. While Human Rights Watch pointed out that under Duvalier, hundreds of Haitians were victims of extrajudicial killings or otherwise died from torture or as a result of inhumane detention conditions, Mother Teresa praised the regime. She said it was a beautiful lesson for me that so many poor people were familiar with their head of state. There was also very little transparency over the money she received from her charity. where despite receiving hundreds of millions of dollars, did little or nothing to improve the facilities. According to a study from the University of Ottawa, doctors observed unfit and unhygienic conditions with a lack of adequate food and painkillers. But it all might have been deliberate, as Mother Teresa responded to such criticism by saying, "There is something beautiful in seeing the poor accept their lot, to suffer it like Christ's passion. The world gains much from their suffering." With such sadism masked as compassion, I had to place Mother Teresa as the worst person Reagan gave the Medal of Freedom to. The first Bush president gave various medals primarily to his conservative allies. He gave the Medal of Freedom to his Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, as well as his Secretary of State and later Chief of Staff James Baker, who would go on to run George W. Bush's legal team during the controversial Florida recount in the 2000 presidential election. George H.W. Bush also awarded Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart and a mega donor to the Republican Party. A more problematic choice for the Medal of Freedom was Senator Strom Thurmond, who ran for president in 1948 as a third-party Dixiecrat on a staunch segregationist platform, saying, "There is not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches." There was also the conservative columnist William F. Buckley. This was just a few years after in 1986 when Buckley wrote in the New York Times that in order to fight the AIDS epidemic, everyone detected with the disease should be tattooed in the upper forearm and on the buttocks. Even with such an unpalpable list already, the person who takes the cake as the worst person awarded under George H.W. Bush is none other than the Iron Lady herself, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher is particularly despicable for her handling of the troubles in Northern Ireland. I've covered this topic extensively in one of the earliest videos on this channel. But to make a long story short, when Republicans in Northern Ireland utilized nonviolent resistance for demands in basic civil rights, she resisted making any concessions, which eventually resulted in the increase in popularity for the Irish Republican Army to wage an armed struggle. When 10 incarcerated Republicans in Northern Ireland went on hunger strike demanding simple prison reforms, she just let them die. With so much blood on her hands, it was a disgrace that George H.W. Bush honored her with the award. As with George W. Bush giving Bill Cosby the Medal of Freedom, Clinton awarding Aung San Suu Kyi is one of those cases in which a choice clearly did not age well. Aung San Suu Kyi was once seen as an international hero for her efforts to democratize Myanmar by encouraging nonviolent resistance against the junta in the 1990s and 2000s, for which she was even awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. But since she took control of the civilian government following the 2015 elections, she has had a spectacular fall from grace for her complicity in the Rohingya genocide, which began right around the time she came into office. She has, ironically, openly defended the very military that had placed her under house arrest in the past. In 2017, when more than 400,000 Rohingya people were forced to leave the country after the military carried out brutal massacres and burned down homes, Aung San Suu Kyi downplayed the situation with as much stupidity as insensitivity. According to her, things couldn't be so bad because more than 50% of the villages were intact. In 2019, Aung San Suu Kyi also went to the International Court of Justice to claim there was no ethnic cleansing at all happening in Myanmar. Instead, she went on the offensive, saying that these were false charges by impatient international actors. Yet, she failed to mention that perhaps they were impatient because her government denied visas for UN investigators to carry out a proper fact-finding mission. While Aung San Suu Kyi's fall from grace has come as a shock to many who once saw her as a hero, there were, apparently, some hints that Clinton could have been aware of in 2000. According to the head of the Burma Campaign UK, Mark Farmaner, who helped train figures within Aung San Suu Kyi's political party, there were always concerns of a lack of any sort of ideology and everything was personality focused. Does this mean she was destined to become an autocrat once in power? It's hard to say, but there might certainly have been more to learn with a more thorough vetting before handing her America's most coveted award. She may have always been less focused on democratization and more interested in establishing a personality cult. To his credit, George W. Bush gave the Medal of Freedom to one of the most deserving figures of them all, Nelson Mandela, in 2002. Yet, in a dazzling case of contradiction, Bush didn't have the courtesy of removing Mandela from the US terrorist watch list until 6 years later, meaning Bush honored a man that America still considered a potential terrorist. While most of his predecessors typically gave the Medal of Freedom awards to former and current statesmen, George W. was more inclined to hand them out to celebrities he happened to like. Some included real icons like Muhammad Ali, and others were just wholesome like Mr. Rogers. But in his last month in office, Bush reverted to the customary pattern with the decision to honor a fellow world leader. Unfortunately, he picked a statesman who deserves more condemnation than praise, British Prime Minister Tony Blair. As Bush's biggest ally, Blair dragged the UK into America's unjustified invasion of Iraq. While there's still debate on how many were killed in the war, the most conservative estimates put the death toll just above 100,000, while some reports suggest more than 600,000. To please his US counterpart, Blair lied to the British public. He wrote to the US president 8 months before the invasion, "I will be with you, whatever." As early as April 2002, Blair was claiming that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction and that he's a threat to his own people and a threat to us also. Saddam Hussein, of course, was not developing weapons of mass destruction, and, as was later confirmed in an official British inquiry into the war, Iraq was certainly no imminent threat to the UK. The 2016 report, led by civil servant Sir John Chilcot, singled out Blair's culpability, noting that the Prime Minister had not been straight with the nation in the lead-up to the invasion. Blair should not have been honored, but along with Bush, prosecuted for war crimes. Former UN weapons inspector for Iraq, Hans Blix, has said Blair should face a tribunal, a sentiment echoed by anti-apartheid activist Desmond Tutu. But the day Blair and Bush will face the consequences of their actions will never come. Instead, they will just pat each other in the back and give each other medals. Speaking of Iraq, let us not forget that it was not only Bush and Blair's war that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The sanctions that the UN Security Council placed against Iraq following the first Gulf War, and which continued throughout Bill Clinton's presidency, may have also led to hundreds of thousands of deaths by preventing food, medicine, and other humanitarian aid from entering the country. According to Professors David Courtwright and George A. Lopez, writing in Columbia University's Journal of International Affairs, never before has a country faced such prolonged economic strangulation, with the value of lost revenues from prohibited oil exports amounting to more than $130 billion, industrial output dropping by 50%, inflation rising by more than 5,000%, and per capita income plummeting to levels equivalent to those found in the poorest nations. Most critically at the stake is the survival of the Iraqi people, especially the most vulnerable, who suffer doubly under the oppression of a totalitarian dictatorship and the grueling consequences of one of the harshest economic blockades in history. So, what does this have to do with Madeleine Albright, and why was it a mistake for Obama to give her the Medal of Freedom? Well, she was, of course, the UN ambassador for President Clinton during the time of these deadly sanctions. But the icing on the cake comes from a response she gave in an infamous interview on the show 60 Minutes. In reference to the sanctions against Iraq, she was asked, "We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?" And Albright responded, "I think this is a very hard choice. But we think the price is worth it." Perhaps it was for the courage to be so blunt and honest about the nature of evil that President Obama gave her the Medal of Freedom in 2012. Some viewers might recall the way Albright raised eyebrows back in 2016. At a campaign rally for Hillary Clinton, Albright had some choice words for women who were supporting Clinton's opponent in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders, saying, "There's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other." I just wonder what sort of place might be reserved for anyone who believes that the murder of 500,000 children is ever worth it. long before there were ultra-conservatives like Tucker Carlson, conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, and misogynistic social media influencers like Andrew Tate, spewing hateful rhetoric on the internet. There was Rush Limbaugh, the #1 rated talk show host from the 1990s until his death in 2021. For younger viewers of this episode, it is hard not to oversell the impact Limbaugh had on the modern-day conservative movement in America, in the same way that George W. Bush honored Tony Blair as a nod and a thank you for making the Iraq War possible. Trump was rewarding Rush Limbaugh for his role in normalizing hate and paving Trump's way to the White House. Whether it's Trump saying disparaging remarks about immigrants or poking fun of those with mental disabilities, it was Limbaugh more than anyone else who made such loathsome rhetoric as a staple of the right. To get a rough picture how disgusting Limbaugh was, let's go through just 5 controversial things he said or did throughout his radio career. In the early 1990s, Limbaugh had a segment on his program called The AIDS Update, where he mocked those who died from the disease. He was also quoted saying that gays deserve their fate. In 2004, when it was revealed that U.S. troops were responsible for torturing and humiliating inmates at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, Limbaugh justified it, saying the guards were just people having a good time and were blowing some steam off. In the same year, he also said that the National Basketball Association should be called Thug Basketball Association, and that they should stop being referred to as teams but as gangs. In 2009, he dismissed the genocide of Native Americans, saying, "Holocaust of 90 million Indians? Only 4 million left? They all have casinos, what's to complain about?" In 2014, he questioned the concept of asking for sexual consent, saying, "How many of you guys in your own experience with women have learned that no means yes if you know how to spot it?" With such a track record, and believe me, I could go on, it is not surprising that Trump chose to honor Limbaugh with the Medal of Freedom. John McCain has a strange reputation. While he was hated by leftists and right-wingers alike by the end of his life, he was also lauded by centrist liberals who saw him as the last decent Republican. McCain evokes a certain nostalgia for a time gone by when politics was apparently less divisive between Democrats and Republicans. Certainly, he was someone who could reach across the aisle to his Senate colleagues, and this old-school collegial persona explains why Biden adored John McCain and honored him with the Medal of Freedom posthumously. But centrist liberals are remembering McCain through rose-colored glasses. He was, in fact, far from moderate, and those on the far right who now criticize McCain are forgetting how much he actually did to empower them. In 1981, McCain joined the advisory board for the Council for World Freedom. This was a group that supplied aid to death squads in Nicaragua, supported apartheid South Africa, and held conferences with former German fascists from World War II, including a delegate who once tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. In 2004, McCain chaired the International Republican Institute, which was accused by a former U.S. ambassador of contributing to the coup d'etat that overthrew Haiti's democratically elected government. In 2013, McCain praised and shared a stage with a Ukrainian fascist named Ole Tyanibuk, who wrote open letters demanding Ukraine do more to halt criminal activities of organized Jewry. And as late as 2017, McCain was a staunch advocate for the dictatorship of Saudi Arabia, as it was carpet bombing and causing a massive famine in Yemen. The UN Security General called the situation in Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And yet, McCain called his Senate colleagues crazy for trying to block a weapons deal with the Saudi government. But domestically, the most consequential thing McCain ever did to empower the far right was picking Sarah Palin as his VP in the 2008 presidential election. If Rush Limbaugh was responsible for normalizing hateful rhetoric, McCain's pick of Palin was equally responsible for opening the door to the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party. And so, in no small measure, McCain is the reason we have Trump. By picking Palin, he enabled fascism in America. Rather than a decent Republican, McCain's legacy should be given the label similar to that of Paul von Hindenburg, the German president who in 1933 appointed Hitler as chancellor and made a Faustian pact with the fascists. Hindenburg was another quote-unquote moderate conservative and a quote-unquote war hero who used his decorative status to shield himself from criticism. But by the end of his life, he betrayed his own people by forging alliances with devils. just like John McCain. Thanks for watching. So who do you think is the worst person to ever receive the Medal of Freedom? Leave a comment below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, as that really helps with the algorithm.